Barfly, located at 4062 Boulevard Saint-Laurent, is not your classic historical venue. There are no velvet curtains, no fancy balconies, no grand theater architecture hiding behind its walls. But to generations of Montreal musicians, this tiny hole in the wall represents something just as important. For decades, this address has been tied to the city's music scene in one form or another: blues, jazz, rock, punk, alternative music. The names changed several times, the crowds changed, and the genres changed, but somehow the room kept filling up with people shoulder to shoulder. Historically, the building itself had lived a relatively quiet life compared to some of the other venues we've covered. There's been no crazy fires, no major disasters, no documented notorious crimes. Despite that, stories continue to circulate about strange paranormal activity inside the building. Stories of music turning itself back on after closing time, objects moving, shadow figures appearing and disappearing without an explanation. Whether those stories belong to a former owner, a disgruntled landlord, or simply decades of memories recorded into its elements, that's the story we're exploring today. So let's turn down the house lights, illuminate the stage, and step into the venue's history. This is Backstage After Dark. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Backstage After Dark. I am Sarah Beaupre. I thank you for coming back a third time to continue listening to the stories I have to offer you. I have been having a great time listening to your stories about the episodes I've covered. If you have any stories about performance venues in Montreal that we haven't covered, you'll be doing me a great favor by sitting me down and telling me about them. If you own a venue and would like to reach out to us to check it out, do not hesitate, because we would love that. Today we're looking at Barfly, one of Montreal's most beloved dive bars and one of the longest running music rooms on the Main. Historically speaking, this stretch of Saint Laurent Boulevard has always been important to Montreal's nightlife. Long before the modern bars and restaurants arrived, the area was known for its clubs, diners, music venues, and the constant movement of people between communities. But before the live music, the address had a different purpose. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, much of this section of Saint Laurent became associated with Montreal's garment industry. Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, French Canadians, and other working class communities filled factories and workshops throughout the neighborhood. Working conditions were often brutal by modern standards. Long hours, child labor, poor ventilation, dangerous machinery, and extremely low wages were common realities throughout the industry. Labor movements and workers' organizations emerged largely because conditions had been impossible to ignore. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on that history, but it's worth remembering that long before live music filled this building, the neighborhood had already witnessed decades of hardship, struggles, and trauma. The earliest reference I found to 4062 Saint Laurent date back to the 1930s. During that decade, the address appears in newspaper articles connected to commercial office activity. Advertisements place an electrical contractor and Imperial Oil Company at the location. Like most buildings on the Main, businesses seem to come and go quite quickly during those times. One challenge when researching this address is that many records alternate between 4062, 4062A, and 4062B Saint Laurent. Earlier records often ignore the letter entirely, making it difficult to determine exactly which tenant occupied which section of the building. So please keep that in mind, as there could be two different businesses running at the same time. In the 1950s, newspaper reports describe an armed robbery involving Sam Cogan, a manufacturer in the children's clothing industry who operated from that address. According to reports, 4 teenagers entered his office, threatened him with a revolver, stole approximately $255, and locked him inside of his office before fleeing. Police later found and arrested the young suspects. Cogan's name continues appearing in business directories and manufacturing records for years afterwards, suggesting he remained connected to the address throughout much of the decade. By the late 1950s, advertisements show companies at the address hiring accountants and office staff connected to the wholesale and children's clothing operations. Then in 1962, the Quebec Manufacturers Directory formally lists Sam Cogan as operating a manufacturing business from 4062 Saint Laurent. After that, Sam's trail largely goes quiet. For decades, the building remained connected to commercial and textile-related activity, before suddenly taking a very different direction in the late 1980s. In early 1988, the address entered Montreal's music history. A man named Gary Sharp applied for permits to operate a bar with dancing and live performances at 4062A Saint Laurent. The venue would then become known as G Sharp. Now, Gary Sharp was never really a businessman, but more of a man obsessed with music. Originally from the Bronx in New York City, Sharp eventually drifted north to Montreal after spending an influential time in California. Before opening his own venue, he reportedly worked under the table in breweries like Molson and O'Keefe's, while saving money and getting to know Montreal's nightlife and music scenes. When he finally opened G Sharp, he wasn't interested in creating a fancy bar. The room was cramped, the drinks were cheap, the stage was tiny, the decor was almost non-existent and was probably very, very sweaty. But that's how Gary liked it. Articles from that period describe mismatched colored light bulbs hanging from the ceiling and crowds packed shoulder to shoulder around the performers. The venue looked less like a carefully designed club and more like chunks of Gary's favorite things being thrown into the corner of a room. Almost everything Gary and the business earned reportedly went back into the booking musicians. Making any profit at all never seemed to matter as much as having the blues culture he loved performing for the crowd. During that time, many venues were moving towards more of a safe music scene look, playing radio hits and booking well-known artists. But Sharp was stubborn and only wanted to play his favorite artists from Chicago and other important cities in jazz. Before long, musicians from Chicago's electric blues scene were making their way to Montreal specifically to play this tiny room on the Main. Legends like Jimmy Rogers, Pinetop Perkins, Joe Louis Walker, Eddie Kirkland, Mississippi Heat, and many others became associated with the venue. Some performers even compared G Sharp to the old juke joints where they had started their careers decades earlier in the American South. Writers who knew Gary described him as loud, stubborn, obsessive, and completely devoted to the music. To many people, he wasn't really a bar owner at all, but more of a friend who will take musicians in and let them play the music he dearly loved. He was keeping the music alive in an unfortunate, dying music scene at the time. By the early 1990s, Montreal's blues scene started struggling. Venues were closing, and the audience was shrinking. It got so bad to the point the city's blues festival disappeared entirely in 1993. Quickly after, in January of 1994, G Sharp closed after Gary reportedly fell 1 month behind on rent. For several musicians, the closure felt less like a loss of a business and more like the loss of one of the last authentic blues rooms left in Montreal. Only weeks later, alcohol permit records already show a new operator applying for a license at the same address. Then the venue became known as L'Extérieur. The music and scene never really changed during this phase. It just felt a little emptier without Gary. Throughout 1994, blues and jazz musicians continued performing there. The room remained small, a little less crowded and rough, carrying pretty much the same atmosphere it had during the G-sharp years. You can consider the address a little haunted itself back in those days, because by May of 1995, newspapers reported that L'Extérieur had already gone out of business, not even a year after G-sharp's closure. Yet almost immediately, the venue reopened again under a new name, Cleo's Jazz Bar. One of only a handful of dedicated jazz rooms in Montreal, Cleo shifted the focus away from Chicago blues and towards jazz programming. Throughout 1995 and 1996, the venue hosted jam sessions, live recordings, and performances by some of Montreal's most respected jazz musicians. But despite the new identity, the room still felt like an underground venue needing for a new change, since the jazz and blues scene was a little dead. Eventually, the address evolved once again into what is now known as Barfly. Over time, blues, rock, and jazz gave way to alternative music. The venue became associated with local bands, underground shows, hockey nights, cheap drinks, and Montreal dive bar culture. One of the things that has never changed about the venue was the sense of community. Even after losing G-sharp, Gary Sharp never completely disappeared from that address. Friends and musicians remember seeing him continue to visit the bars that followed. The room was no longer his, but he remained supportive all these years to the new owners who managed it. Then in 1999, Gary Sharp died suddenly of a heart attack while sitting outside of one of his favorite restaurants, Euro Deli. He was only 45 years old. The loss was deeply felt throughout Montreal's blues community. For many musicians, Gary had become one of the people responsible for keeping the city's blues scene alive during the scene's dying days in the 90s. The names, the crowds, and the music changed, but the stories remained. Today, Barfly is often described as one of Montreal's most authentic dive bars. The venue continues supporting local musicians, independent artists, and underground music scenes of every genre. Which brings us to the reason why this address appears in the ghost stories at all. According to staff, regulars, and local paranormal lore, strange activity has been reported inside the building after closing time. Music systems are reportedly turning themselves back on. The temperatures suddenly change. Poltergeist activity, such as bar stools moving or falling after being stacked for the night. Objects appearing where they shouldn't be, and occasional reports of a shadowy figure appearing briefly before disappearing altogether. Many people naturally associate these stories with Gary Sharp. According to local legend, the former owner never left the room he spent years building. He could be the one blasting tunes way after closing time and taking down the chairs so people can continue listening to the music. Some believe the activity reflects a music fan who simply doesn't want the night to end. Others have suggested that it could be an old, disgruntled landlord angry about the hours of operation, or a person from the 1930s who had lost their life due to an accident in the textile industry. After all, Gary wasn't the only person connected to the address over the decades. Businesses came and went, owners came and went, tenants came and went. Some businesses struggled, some disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Like most good ghost stories, nobody really knows who is around or what is going on when the lights turn off. What we do know is that after more than a century of businesses, musicians, workers, owners, and performers passing through, the building continues to attract people who care about music more than profit. This makes supporting the venue in any way possible much more important, ghosts or not. Barfly remains one of the last places on the Main where the people watching the show is more important than what the place itself looks like or how much money they make. Maybe that's exactly what Gary would have wanted. Please, if you have the opportunity, support this little venue at all costs in any way that you can, including the musicians who book their shows on the stage. This has been another episode of Backstage After Dark. I thank you for listening, and it's been a pleasure to tell you my story.